Good.
You know.
Moving it slowly, but it's moving it.
Good morning. On behalf of the Yes North Reading Ballot Committee, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. As you know, on Tuesday, May 7th, you're going to be asked to make an investment in your community by voting yes on questions 1 and 2. Question 1 is in reference to an operation override for $2.1 million. John Murphy is going to be here on behalf of the entire Board of Selectmen to talk about what is involved, what you can get for that investment, and the implications if the override fails. Question 2, once again, revisits the ongoing need to do something about replacing the undersized and dilapidated Batchelder School. Jonathan DeSimone of the Elementary School Building Committee is here to talk about the process that the ESBC has followed for the last 10 months and why the ESBC is recommending that we vote for Swan Pond. We'll begin with John Murphy.
Thanks, Amy. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of the entire Board of Selectmen to present to the community some facts and figures regarding the operating override, what is involved in the budget process, and a little bit about Prop 2.5. And to start with, what I really want to talk about is that the budget process, this was a community budget. This was not just a general government budget, not just a school budget, but a community budget. So the process, the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Planning Team. The Finance Planning Team is made up of the Chair and Vice Chair of the Board of Selectmen and the School Committee and the Finance Committee, as well as the School Business Manager, the Superintendent of Schools, and Tom Younger, our Town Administrator. And some of the things that we dealt with as we went through the budget process, first and foremost, for the first time ever, we conducted a forward-looking budget process using multi-year forecasts so that we could look at what we were facing in the coming fiscal years. So we did a 3-year forecast. We set priorities for services based on available revenue. And last but not least, we wanted to minimize the impact. We went through the budget process and we talked about absolute needs, not wants. So there's not fat and fluff in the budget, whether we're talking about the general government budget or the school budget. These are absolute needs, not wants. Let's talk just briefly about Prop 2.5 and what it means. Prop 2.5, the driving force on the Prop 2.5 is what's called the levy limit, which is the maximum total local tax in a given year. North Reading currently taxes pretty much to the levy limit and has for the past 10 years or so. The levy limit can be increased annually by 2.5% plus new growth. And new growth is calculated as the increase in assessed valuation due to new development multiplied by the tax rate. So when you think about this, when you think about Prop 2.5, really what you're talking about is revenue growth of 2.5% a year to fund your operating budget. That's what Prop 2.5 does to not only North Reading, but all communities throughout the Commonwealth. Since the inception of Prop 2.5, 64% of municipalities have passed an operating override. This information comes from the Department of Revenue, and you only need to read the, whether it's the local paper or the Lawrence Eagle Tribune or the Boston Globe, or just watch the newscast. Throughout the Commonwealth, everyone is facing the same issues that North Reading is facing in terms of revenue constraints. Again, we have a 2.5% growth in revenue, and we have a lot of fixed costs. Let's talk briefly about an override versus a debt exclusion. The operating override, question 1, is a permanent increase in the levy limit. Although the selectmen can tax below that limit, and for the public to know, I told the board the night of town meeting, and the board was in agreement that should the revenue picture change at a state level, that we will not tax to the levy limit. We will not use up the entire override unless we have to. And then an override increases the amount available, again, for the operating expense budget. Versus a debt exclusion, which is question 2, a debt exclusion is a temporary increase in the tax rate for a specific project. And that taxation remains on the tax rate until the debt is repaid. So let's talk briefly about why Prop 2.5 isn't sufficient. As I mentioned, you've got a 2.5% growth in revenues. Let's look at some of our costs, some of our fixed costs that we can't do anything about. As a matter of fact, this morning in the Boston Globe in the Northwest Weekly section, there was an article regarding health insurance costs throughout the Northwest communities, and actually North Reading was quoted in that article. Our health insurance costs are up 30%. Take a look at the budget. The biggest portion of the budget is salaries. We're a service organization, and so the biggest portion is salaries, and the cost of insurance, health insurance for the community is up 30%. County retirements are up 10%, and the Medicare obligation is up 25%. So again, just to highlight some of the budget impacts that are outside the control of the town, and if you remember, we can only grow the revenue by 2.5%, and then you look at just these 4 items, it's 1.7 million more than we can, almost more than we can grow it. 10%, we factored in a 10% reduction in state aid. That's $542,000. We had $412,000 in retirement costs. We had $131,000 in a one-time court judgment. And we had $631,000 increase in benefit costs. That's health insurance as well as retirements and the Medicare obligation. So a total cost structure that's outside of our control. So before we even begin the budget process, we're faced with a $1.7 million increase in the cost structure. During the budget process, as I mentioned, we set priorities. We had a lot of joint meetings. The finance planning team met weekly, but then at a joint meeting between the Board of Selectmen and the School Committee and the Finance Committee, the Board of Selectmen voted to transfer $736,000 from general government to the schools. The reason for that transfer was that the revenues available were insufficient to cover the school budget. Even with the $736,000 transfer, those revenues would be insufficient to cover the school budget, but it was a consensus of the board that something needed to be done on the school side because that reduction was too dramatic. And that if we did not get an override, the schools could not live with the revenues available, which were some $15 million. So we made that transfer, which changed the available revenues. And the way in which we came up with that transfer was we had a reduction in the general government staff and services of $398,000. And that's made up of cuts to the library, cuts to the building inspection department, inspectional services, cuts to elderly services, as well as other cuts to some of the small capital needs, etc. And then we, in order to minimize the impact of that transfer and the impact it would have on town services, we voted to institute a $180 per household trash fee. That would generate net revenue of $325,000. In addition to that $180 fee, we would also institute curbside recycling. And the reason that we would do that is because we would be concerned about if we just have a trash collection service, it's not pay as you throw, then we could add additional tonnage into the solid waste stream and that would have a negative impact on the budget, so it was important to the board to institute that trash fee with a recycling program. So this is basically the non-override budget. Now let's take a look at the override budget. The school department budget request is some $17 million. Available revenue, again, this is exclusive of the transfer and some other minor changes that were made. So that leaves the school department with a shortfall of $1.8 million. On the general government side, the budget request you see there includes some of the small capital items that were cut, that we really shouldn't have cut, and it also excludes the transfer that was made to the school department. That leaves general government with a shortfall of $372,000. So the total shortfall, some $2,194,000, hence the request for an override of $2,150,000. Yes, there is a small discrepancy there, but some of the numbers, particularly on the revenue side, will change somewhat. So we felt that requesting an override of $2,150,000, again, we're trying to go for the lowest number possible. So now let's take a look at the override and the no override budgets. This goes back to a point earlier that this budget is built based on absolute needs, not wants. One only needs to look at some of these numbers and look at the red in those columns, and you look at the red in the override column as well. We didn't build a lot of things in. There's not a lot of there are no extra things in here. There are requests that departments made that were not honored. There are items that department heads requested that were not honored. So we've built a budget that addresses what we feel are the absolute needs and priorities for the community. So on the no override column, you see administration down 0.41%. On an override basis, you see it up 1.52. The next two items, general insurance and benefits, again, you can see the cost structure that's built in to the budget that we cannot really control. Again, because we're a service organization and our largest component of the budget is staffing, so those items have a adverse impact when we build the budget. A slight increase in benefits in the override budget is because there will be additions to staff on the school side, but not on the general government side. See the finance department down 6% in the no override budget and down a little over 3% in an override budget. See public safety down 4.6%, no override, and you see a ever so slight increase in the override. You see public works. The reason that public works in the no override budget is up 1.4% is the cost of the recycling program. So in the override budget, we would not institute the trash fee. We would not, at least not at this time, have curbside recycling. That budget, the override budget, public works would be down 0.5. General services, you see down 15%. That is because some of the largest cuts came to some of the budgets that are included in general services, the library, outdoor services, inspectional services. Those were some of the areas that sustained some of the largest cuts in the no override budget. So you see in the override budget, they're actually up 2.93%. Land use is down under both scenarios, and you see education is really the only budget that we're increasing in both scenarios. The increase in the no override budget of 3.78 is not enough to sustain all of the current services, but it provides them a lesser impact, a large impact nonetheless, but a lesser impact than would have been sustained had we not transferred the 736. And you see the override budget